There's a story about a man who wanted to do something extra special. Just loved his mom. And on Mother's Day, he just wanted to do something special. So the week before, he went to this pet store. And he bought one of those talking birds. Now, this wasn't just an ordinary talking bird, though. This bird could whistle Amazing Grace. This bird could recite the 23rd Psalm. Cost $10,000. Thought, well, it's worth it. It's worth it. So he had the bird sent through a special courier right there at he didn't have to take the bird. He just kind of had it shipped out, packaged, or whatever they do to a bird, and shipped it out to his mother. He called her on Mother's Day. And before he could get a word out, she said, "Wow, thank you for that bird, son. It was wonderful. It was delicious." As you're turning to Luke chapter 2 today, I thought it would be helpful to talk about the relationship between Mary and Jesus on this Mother's Day. You know, we talk about Naomi, we talk about Ruth, we go into Proverbs 31 a lot on Mother's Day, but this morning let's look at Jesus and his mom. Could we do that today? As we go to Luke chapter 2. You know, Mary, she appears at various places throughout the Gospels, and we even see her in the book of Acts. Her husband, Joseph, isn't mentioned after the second chapter of Luke when Jesus was 12, probably because he had passed away. But Mary, hey, she's there from start to finish. When we see how they related to one another, we can learn something about relationships. And not only do we learn more about the humanity of Christ, we also see an example of how parents need to relate to their children, how children should relate to their parents. And today's message is going to show us maybe some ways we can become a little bit more like Jesus in that regard. So this morning I'm going to take a look at 3 different images from the Gospels that gives us insight into Jesus' relationship with his mom. And the first thing I want you to see is that Jesus, he learned from Mary. I tell you what, we are so fully convinced of the deity of Christ that we sometimes forget he was also fully human. He came into the world as a little baby, Bethlehem, the angels, the shepherds, all of that. Just like newborn babies everywhere come into the world. Every December, what do we sing, The little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. Well, it might make for some good poetry, but wasn't too accurate. Jesus cried like all babies cry. He needed to sleep. He needed to eat. He needed to be changed. He had to learn to walk, he had to learn to talk, had to learn his numbers, had to learn his letters, had to learn how to add and subtract, how to read and write. We need to remember that Jesus the toddler wasn't walking through the house saying, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, I need my afternoon snack." I don't think that happened. He was a child like all children. He grew up learning what all toddlers need to learn, what all little boys need to learn, what all young men need to learn. And he did this under the guidance of Mary and Joseph. Now we see from the very beginning, Mary and Joseph, they did their best to do everything right. Fallen creatures, yes. But they did their best to do everything right. On the 8th day after Jesus was born, they took him over to be circumcised. And Luke writes, "And when the days of their purification, according to the law of Moses, were finished, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord." There in Luke 2:22. And later on, it says in Luke 2:39, when they had completed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. I tell you what, if any child in the world could be left alone to find his own way, to make all the right choices for himself, it would have been Jesus. And yet from the very beginning, Mary and Joseph were sure that Jesus had a strong connection to his faith. From the very beginning, they followed the rituals. They presented him in the temple. And as we're going to see in a minute, they taught him to observe Passover. They knew that it was their responsibility to bring up this child in the way of the Lord. Now, parents, moms especially, don't forget that you have more influence in your children's lives than anybody. And you have far more influence than you realize. Moms, you need to be the voice that helps your children connect to the best decisions they can possibly make for their own future. Moms and dads, make sure you do more than provide for them. Make sure they have every opportunity to learn from you. Now, let's fast forward a little bit. No longer a toddler. We go forward a few years and we see that Jesus and Joseph and Mary, they went to Jerusalem with a large group from their community in Nazareth and their friends and relatives. And it's a few days' journey. It's just not walking across the street. And on the way home, on the second day of the return journey, I can't wait to see the video one day of this, by the way. Mary and Joseph realized that Jesus wasn't with them. He wasn't in the group. Moms and dads, we're all going, oh, right now, right? I tell you what, they freaked out. They went back to Jerusalem. They spent 3 days looking for Jesus. Finally found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them, asking questions. Now, when you look at this, you say, man, talk about negligence. They'd haul you out and throw you in jail for that today. But that's not the case. That's not what was going on. You see, in those days, they would travel in big groups. And the ladies, they might be in one group, and the guys would be in another group. And so when they got about a day's away, they finally figured out, I thought you had him. Can't you hear it? I thought he was with you. Freak out. And they go back to Jerusalem. They start looking around. The phrase in the Hebrew, the idiom that describes the activity. It's the activity of a student. In other words, Jesus was in the temple learning. And Mary says to Jesus, why have you treated us this way? We were worried. Jesus said to Mary, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house? Now keep in mind, 12-year-old boy. It's a lot different than a 12-year-old boy now. A 12-year-old boy in the first century was just 1 year away of being a man. Fully accountable as a man at the age of 13. So he was turning the corner of a new stage of independence. Mom, do you remember the first time you walked down the street with your child and you didn't hold hands? Hard to do, wasn't it? Remember how difficult that was? Or the first time they went somewhere by themselves? Or the first time they drove? We can't be helicopter parents forever. And at some point we have to let our sons and daughters take those first steps toward independence. But there's a couple things I want you to notice about this part of the story here. First, Luke writes about those who were with Jesus in the temple. And verse 47 says, and all those who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. Good job, Mary. Good job, Joseph. This shows the kind of home life Jesus had and the teaching he was getting. Now remember, Jesus didn't arrive in the manger with a full head of knowledge. Everything Jesus knew while he was on earth, he learned while he was here on earth. Because Mary and Joseph created such an environment for him that he was able to grow and learn as he needed to. Now there's another statement in this story I want you to take a look at. You've got your swords out, you've got your Bibles open. Look at verse 51 and 52. It says, then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother kept all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with people. I can't tell you. I don't know. We don't know when Jesus fully understood everything about who he was and about what his mission was to be. Maybe this story shows a little bit about maybe a little bit about the start of that realization. But what we see from Jesus is that he continued to be obedient to his parents. He kept learning. He continued to grow physically and spiritually. Now we see these accounts of Jesus' early life, and we say, man, this young lad, he's a learner. He's grabbing onto everything he can learn. He was a student of the Word. And we read the Gospels, we read about, he would spend a night alone in prayer. Where do you think he learned that? At the feet of his mom and his dad. So moms, I tell you, this is your special day. I want to give you a special exhortation. Make it your lifelong mission to teach your kids, to teach your children every good and right and holy thing that they need to know. Now, Mary planting the seeds of growth throughout Jesus' childhood is what makes this next image of his ministry possible. We see that Jesus listened to Mary. After the story of Jesus getting separated from Mary and Joseph, there is a huge gap in the timeline. We don't know what went on for 18 years. Until he starts his ministry, we have nothing else to tell us about how his young life was. It is likely that when Jesus was still a teenager, Joseph died. It's very likely that as the eldest son, it would have been on Jesus to provide for the family. Maybe he spent those years taking care of mom, taking care of his younger brothers and sisters, until the time was right to begin his public ministry. Now, the ministry of Jesus began when he's baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist, his cousin. And then he spends 40 days in the desert being tempted by the devil. And when he returns to Nazareth, he starts attracting his first followers. And by the time he shows up at this next little situation, it's a wedding, by the way. By the time he shows up at this wedding in Cana, the town in Galilee, he's got about 4 or 5 followers. He's got Simon Peter, he's got Andrew, he's got Nathaniel's there following him at this point, being with him. He's got Philip, and very probably John is along for the ride at this point. Now, this was one of those weddings where it is very different from nowadays. They ran out of wine. Today we would say, hey, you drank us out of house and home. Be on your way. No wine for you. But in that Jewish culture, it would have been shame. Shame on the host family. It would have been a black mark on the marriage. So Mary comes to Jesus and she says, hey, they've run out of wine. And Jesus' response, as we read it in today's version, might sound harsh. It might almost sound like he's yelling at his mom. But in the language in which Jesus spoke, his response was very respectful. He simply says, "What does this have to do with me? My time has not yet come." And you may have scratched your head about that a little bit. Because Mary, she saw something in Jesus that he had not yet seen. Mothers, you can relate to that. She saw that his time had in fact come. She didn't say anything else to him. She just told the servants, "Hey, you do whatever he tells you to do." Jesus told the servants to fill some stone jars with water. He turned it into wine, served to the guest. Now you might be wondering this morning, why did he say to Mary, "My time has not yet come," and then he turns right around and turns the water into wine? Because Jesus understood at that moment that the Father was speaking to him through Mary. The person he could trust more than anyone else on earth. God the Father was speaking through Mary, telling Jesus, "Yeah, son, your time has come." So the story of the wedding in Cana gives us an understanding of the relationship between Jesus and his mother. She saw him as he really was and as he really is. As far as everyone else was concerned, he was just a carpenter, you know. His brothers and sisters thought he was nuts. But Mary knew who he was all along for obvious reasons. And God used her to help Jesus take the first necessary steps toward public ministry. The lesson for us is clear. Moms, your children need you to see in them what the rest of the world can't see. They need you to see them in terms of their potential, in terms of their possibilities. They will never get too old for you to speak a word of encouragement into their lives. And for the rest of us, you need to remember that your mom has a unique perspective on your life and what's best for you. Heed that information. She may not always be right, but I tell you what, she's right enough to where you need to bend an ear and listen and take heed. Jesus learned from Mary and Joseph. He was obedient to them. He listened to Mary so that God could use her to get the ball rolling in his ministry. And here's the third thing I want you to see. I want you to see how Jesus looked after Mary. So here we jump ahead now, 3 more years. Jesus was arrested. He was abandoned by all of his disciples, and well, all but one. He was beaten, mocked, humiliated, hung on a cross to die a painful death. And almost everyone who followed him, it was vamoose time. They took off. But I tell you who was there. Mary was there. She watched as he died alone, forsaken for a moment even by his heavenly Father. But she was there. And she watched as the little boy she held in her arms, whom she taught to pray, who bandaged his knees when he got all skinned up, and took care of him in so many ways. In the midst of a crowd of jeering onlookers, she watched him die a violent death. And all the disciples had run away, except for one, John. John was there. And from the cross, Jesus spoke to Mary, and he said, "Dear woman, here is your son." And he spoke to John, says, "Here's your mother." Jesus could not breathe his final breath without making sure that his mom would be taken care of. Now, as we grow older, we reach a point where we no longer are relating to mom and dad as terms, in what they can do for us. We start switching gears as we mature. And we switch over in terms of what we can do for them. And really, the earlier you can turn this relational corner with your parents, the better you are. The stronger and more emotionally healthier you'll be. Now, the balance you owe to your parents will never be paid in full. It's just how it is. But you need to pay what you can. Part of growing up, whether you're a teenager, or whether you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s, is that your relationship with your parents, especially your mom, is no longer taken for granted. We take them for granted when they're young because we don't know any better. But once we've grown up, at whatever age that might occur, we need to look out for them in the same way they looked out for us. When John baptized Jesus, the heavens opened and a voice from above, what did he say? He said, "This is my son whom I love, with whom I am well pleased." You know what? At that point, Jesus hadn't done a whole lot. He hadn't done anything Messiah-like. As far as we know, he hadn't healed anybody. He had performed no miracles. Maybe he had never even delivered a sermon anywhere. And Jesus, at this point, who was Jesus? I'll tell you who he was. He was a good son, a good brother, a hard worker, and a faithful Jew. And with this, God was pleased. I would say that the same is true for you and me. God is well pleased when we honor our relationship with our parents. Sons and daughters, I'm challenging you today to be like Jesus in this regard. Never stop learning all that you can from your parents. Never stop listening to what they have to say. Never stop looking out for them. And I just want to wrap up by saying, moms, congratulations. Congratulations on this special day. And thank you for the role that you've played in the lives of your children. I want to remind you, that role never ends. Never ends. Your children will never stop needing you, even though sometimes they may well give that impression. They'll never stop needing you, so today I encourage you to never stop. Never stop being that example to them. Never stop seeing them in terms of their potential. And I tell you what, never stop needing them either. May the Lord bless you today.
I bet you could.